Dream for a better future. That's what the participants at today's Scotland 2050 conference were asked to do. The inaugural event invited senior politicians and other influential figures to explain how they want the nation to look by the middle of the century. There was much to agree on, but the polarising issue of our constitutional future also loomed large. In a few minutes, we'll discuss some of the challenges and opportunities with a panel of guests. Before that, Scotland Tonight's Adam Todd has this report.
We're outside the Georgian grandeur of the Assembly Rooms here in Edinburgh, where political leaders and industry figures have gathered to ask one big question: what kind of country should Scotland be in 2050?
I think by its very nature, politics is very short term. There's a 5-year cycle, that's a parliamentary term. What I'm trying to achieve here is go beyond the parliamentary term. I think that's the conversation we need to be having in Scotland about where we want to be by 2050. We've got big issues like housing, NHS. If we don't address them now, it could be worse by 2050 as well.
This conference is designed to forge consensus across the political divide, but there was one polarising issue which was hard to ignore: Scottish independence, which was the theme of the First Minister's speech.
Independence is the defining choice for this generation. Have no doubt about that, because the UK status quo has proved itself incapable of delivering on the hopes and the ambitions of the people of Scotland. That is why, like a clear majority of Scots, I believe our nation should have the right to choose our future.
John Swinney today in his speech said that successive UK governments see Scotland as an afterthought. Is he wrong?
Well, it says something about a man that has been at the heart of government for almost 2 decades, where he's had the opportunity to transform people's lives here in Scotland, that the best he has to offer less than a year from an election here in Scotland is just the same old argument and the same old constitutional criticisms. That's why we need a new approach that goes away from the politics of blame and fear from the SNP and a new direction for the Scottish Labour.
John Swinney's only talking about independence to fend off a rearguard action from his malcontents within his own party. Nobody I speak to on the doorsteps is concerned about the Constitution anymore.
While the constitutional question remains a clear dividing line in Scottish politics, there's a growing sense amongst the public that politicians are too focused on the short term. So is that the case?
Well, certainly the fact that there have been so many elections over the last few years, I guess, focuses the mind on the short term. With John Swinney as First Minister, we are being strongly encouraged to take a longer-term view of things. Today, he publishes, for example, a 10-year plan for population health that lifts our eyes beyond the short term. And I think a conference like Scotland 2050 requires us to do the same.
Beyond big picture politics, there have been serious discussions on the real issues shaping Scots right now, from the housing emergency to the climate crisis, and the role of women in shaping policy and leadership.
Well, we're still not doing enough to ensure women have equal opportunities to men. And just in this last couple of weeks, the World Economic Forum published this year's Global Gender Pay Gap Report, which shows it's going to take 124 years globally for women to reach equality with men. And that really is just not good enough.
Members of the public have been here today listening to those on stage. So what have they made of what they've heard?
I think what it's revealed is nobody quite has the answer yet, but we need to start that discussion, and there's a lot of really good ideas coming forward about what we need to be doing.
I feel left behind. I feel like there's a fake hearing where they talk about wanting to listen to us without actually doing so. So having young people at the heart of their conversations would be better moving forward. That's why I'm here at this conference.
I think that right now what we need is politicians that are acting, because I think it's such a cliche to say, actions speak louder than words.
Experts are very good at saying, here's the problem. And you know what? All the politicians, and we heard it both from the First Minister and from Anas Sarwar and from Alex Cole-Hamilton today, saying, yes, we agree that these are problems. But then when you start to interrogate them, what are the solutions to these problems? That's when they start to get woolly. So in short, it crystallises problems very well, and it does demonstrate, I think, that our political classes have a dearth of answers to these deep-rooted problems.
With less than a year to go until the 2026 Scottish election, the big question for politicians is whether they will offer bold visions for Scotland's future or stick to safe and familiar messages to win votes in the short term.
With us now in the studio, the man who chaired the conference, the political broadcaster Bernard Ponsonby, whom we heard from in Adam's report. And to consider the future of the nation, we're also joined by the broadcaster and campaigner Lesley Riddoch and the Associate Director of Glasgow University's Centre for Public Policy, Kezia Dugdale, who once led the Scottish Labour Party. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Bernard, John Swinney said that today was as close to 2050 as it was to the founding of the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. And we heard you there saying that the identification of the problems was good, not so many solutions.
Yeah, for example, the very first panel looked at what is an increasingly big issue for young people, and that is intergenerational unfairness. Now, I'm a baby boomer, and that meant that I got a grant at university, I got a subsidised mortgage, I was in the labour market when it was very stable, and when I decided to get out of STV, I got out with a pension. None of that can you say that young people are going to have that today. So everybody knew that there was an issue with intergenerational fairness. It was crystallised very, very well, and it was crystallised well by the testimony from the audience. But when you started to put specific questions to the politicians, is the triple lock, for example, sustainable? Oh, well, we might have to look at that. Every time you questioned a politician on a specific issue which involved them taking scarce resources because public expenditure is not infinite, and you challenged them to reorder their priorities, all of a sudden they clammed up.
And we'll explore the politicians a wee bit more shortly, but Kezia, we're looking ahead to 2050. What do you think's the big change that has to happen?
The number one issue has got to be improving Scotland's health. We know a little bit about what the world might look like in 2050 thanks to the recent work of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, which has done some long-term forecasting. And it's told us that by the end of this decade, we'll be spending 40% of the whole of the Scottish Government's budget on the NHS. By 2050, that will be about 50% of every penny that the Scottish Government has. And that's because as a country at the moment, we're set to be poorer, older and sicker than the rest of the UK counterparts. So we've got to focus now on improving the health of Scots so that those people who are 50 today can have as healthy a life as possible in 2050 at the age of 75.
Lesley, we're hearing Kezia talk there about health. We heard Bernard talk about intergenerational unfairness. Does the governance need to change to allow things like that to happen?
In a way, all political parties are caught in an electoral cycle which determines an awful lot of the policy they come up with. They're not ideas factories. There's very few. It's a long time since we had big, really bold ideas in politics across the whole of these islands, basically. Apart from ones that no Scots voted for. Perhaps you could say Thatcher was the last one who had big, bold ideas, and we're still working through the debris of that not having been properly corrected or addressed. So for sure, I would agree when Kezia is talking about us being poorer, sicker and older than the rest of the UK. I know it's shameful and it's true. I would like to see really big, substantial shifts so that there's far more income coming to Scotland, so we're not kind of having to penny pinch on questions of health. I mean, recently I was talking, my mother's lot came from Caithness. It's a scandal that mothers in Caithness have to get down to Inverness to give birth. There's all sorts of shortcuts happening around the place because you can't get consultants to go there. In other countries with relatively remote areas, they give them tax breaks. They give all sorts of incentives to get public services right where they need them. And the reason they can do that, I'm sorry to make the early mention of Norway, is because they have got energy income, which Scotland doesn't have within the UK. So it's not like I'm banging the drum for independence all the time and immediately. It's just that when you try to look for how you can get out of this bind, more policy documents and whatever, I don't know if that's going to cut it. We need some major shifts.
We'll look at the independence question shortly, but on the point that has been made, Kezia, about big ideas. You were a leader of a party in Scotland. Big ideas take thought, time to think, time to look ahead. Is that possible for a politician in Scotland?
I think it's probably harder for a politician in Scotland than it is elsewhere in the UK because of the perpetual cycle of elections that we have. So in the time that I was Labour leader, just over 2 years or so, I faced 4 elections in that short space of time. So you're constantly in that election mode, trying to raise money for the party, trying to select candidates, thinking about all that internal wiring that really matters. So there isn't enough space within parties for those big ideas that Leslie references, but there's vast amounts of them in Scotland and indeed across the globe to draw from. And one of the things I think we do need to get better at, and it's something we're trying to do at the Centre for Public Policy, is get more of that evidence into our Parliament, using experts and academics from around the globe and bringing their expertise into our policy-making process.
Bernard, can politicians set aside short-term interest? Will the electorate even allow them to?
I mean, Leslie hit the nail on the head. It's all to do with the electoral cycle. I mean, at that conference today, quite a lot of academics and experts were saying, here's the problem. They quantify the problem. They make the point, in order to solve deep-rooted problems, you can't do it in 5 years or even 10 years. You have to have 15, 20 years to solve some of the really deep-rooted problems that we have. But political parties are not geared up, and it is not in their DNA to plan for 20 years. It is in the DNA of a political party to win elections, and if win elections means that you make spending commitments for the short term, then that is what they do. And they will turn a blind eye to manifest unfairness. I mean, for example, the council tax, for example. The SNP elected in 27, we will scrap the unfair council tax. It's still here. Not only that, 60% of properties in Scotland are in the wrong band because we're working off a valuation system which was there in 1991. The government know there is manifest unfairness, which is unfair to people in Scotland at the moment. They daren't do anything about it, because the minute that they do anything about it, they run the risk of making themselves unpopular. Same arguments about whether or not if you have addressed, I don't think they should do it just now. I think the triple lock has some way to go yet, but at the point when the state pensions start to become comparable with other European countries, you're going to have an argument about whether or not it's sustainable in the longer term. Well, they won't have it because they don't want to run the risk of losing votes. And at the end of the day, the demands of the electoral cycle and the culture of political parties, in my view, is not suited to dealing with problems which take 15, 20-year solutions.
And Leslie, if we're governed by the electoral cycle and the electorate are critical of politicians for not delivering, is it actually the electorate that's to blame? Because as Bernard said, people might not vote for these ideas.
No. No. I mean, this is, everybody starts going, oh, they're apathetic. Oh, look at the 28% turnout. The structures are so bad here. I mean, first of all, we don't have a proportional system. It's better than Westminster. They're still having first past the post local elections in England, which is mind-blowing. They share that voting system with one other country in Europe, Belarus. So, you know, we're doing not too bad, but we need to get more proportional. That's a relatively small thing. The other massive thing that we're different about is how utterly centralised Scotland is. So we were promised with the Scottish Parliament that one of the outcomes would be a properly decentralised country. And just to get an idea of how bad we are, our councils are the largest in the world apart from North Korea. So we have 175,000 people, and we call that local council. We have 32 councils. Norway, same size, has got 400. And what that means is we're flaring people off in Scotland from being part of anything political. So when we talk about politics, we talk about 129 people in Holyrood. Nobody else behaves like that, not even America. Despite having Trump at the top, they've got vigorous states, they've got vigorous councils. So we need to really urgently get councils the size of communities all over Scotland with power, cash, income, and then we would be joining the rest of the world.
Does that allow for big ideas, though? Does small authority allow for big ideas?
Well, funnily enough, you know, the countries that keep tediously topping every blinking chart of everything, it is the Nordics. have got the smallest, they are the smallest councils. And that's what is really the bedrock of their achievement, that and actually having children go to school later at 6 or 7. There's some really, these to me are pretty easy things to do. They're difficult things to fund. And there you hit again against most of your income is already spoken for. And if you want to make step changes like that, to have kids going to school when the academics tell us they're ready to learn, which is 6 to 7, and having that vital early play stage, you would need to have more income at your disposal and more levers. And that brings us back to the I word.
On the I word then, Kezia, you think the I word, the independence debate, should be put on hold and that we could actually benefit from that just for the time being?
So I'm not sure where you got that from, John. I'm kind of neither here nor there on the question of when the next independence referendum should be. I am really focused on how you make devolution work in the interim, though. And one of the things that isn't working is the fiscal framework, which is a mechanism that transfers money from the UK government to Scotland. At the moment, it leaves the Scottish government with a really short window to set a budget for the forthcoming 1 year. If we want to get serious about doing some of these preventative public policies and making sure we can deliver that healthier Scotland that we all want, we've got to get the Scottish Government in a position where it can set at the minimum a 3-year budget, ideally a 5-year budget, and have confidence about the amount of money that it has. The fiscal framework does not allow Scotland to do that. Equally, it doesn't allow Scotland to keep the receipts of its own economic growth, because it's always anchored against what that economic growth is relative to what the economy is doing elsewhere in the United Kingdom. That's a game that Scotland can never win for as long as we've got the banking industry in London and all the growth focused in that part of the country. That can be fixed. We can have a better, more functioning version of devolution which allows Scotland to go its own way and retain the security that it wants for the United Kingdom, but it needs that urgent review. The fiscal framework and all of those aspects of how devolution works in practice are long overdue a proper look.
I wouldn't want to misquote, but would you not think, have you not said that a Labour SNP coalition actually could be very powerful for Scotland if the I word was set aside?
So to me, the most common sense thing that could happen in next year's election, and is also the least likely thing to happen, is that Labour and the SNP could join forces and form a coalition. The numbers suggest to us right now that there isn't going to be a party with majority control next year. It will have to be a combination of different parties. And I would really like to see parties of the left coalesce with a long-term plan for Scotland. And the way to get through that is to have a resolution around what you do about the Constitution, a mechanism which would trigger an independence referendum should Scotland want that. That's not about me arguing one side or the other of that constitutional question. I think everybody knows where I stand on that issue. What I'm interested in is what are the barriers that stop two dominant centre-left parties in Scotland working together for the common interests of the country. I think many of the problems Scotland have had over the last 25 years is because those two parties have been set against each other in a horrible retail politics where we are ultimately the losers. If there's a way through that, I think we'd start to get to a position where we could make long-term policies in the interest of the country.
You chaired the conference today, and we heard John Swinney and we heard Anna Sarwar. There was no indication that independence isn't going to still be to the forefront for the foreseeable future and potentially up to 2050.
Well, the SNP have a national council at the weekend, and John Swinney has made it clear there will have to be something in the manifesto about independence. What we're not sure is what he's going to put in terms of strategy. There is a sense, in which, and I know people get obsessed about the constitutional question, we have the constitutional status quo, even if we'd voted for independence in 2014. Do you know what? All of these big strategic questions that we have to face, we would be facing with independence, because every other Western democracy is facing exactly the same question. And really it's all about how do you make your public services in particular sustainable? And by sustainable you mean affordable. And Kez is right in a sense that there is a need for the centre-left parties, who by and large are always going to run this parliament, to agree what the priorities are going forward and not allow any long-term plan to be jettisoned by short-term political considerations. The astonishing thing about that conference today, Leslie will know this because she will have chaired these conferences as well, you actually listen to a lot of these political leaders and it's astonishing how much they agree with. It really is astonishing how much common ground they have. But then when it comes to Parliament and the elections, it all falls apart. A lot of it, you know, is utter phony.
Is that true, Leslie, from your experience?
Well, yes, in one way, but this is not to minimise the deep convictions and the problems people are trying to overcome by looking at different constitutional arrangements. For example, can we ever be a member of the EU again within the UK? Because that has big ramifications for the economy, for staffing, for the viability of businesses. Can we ever do district heating even, that John Swinney talked about, if the Scottish Parliament, government, is not allowed to borrow properly? Will we ever get that? How long are we going to wait?
Well, there's a question. OK, we've got a few minutes, a couple of minutes left. Kezia, we're looking ahead to 2050. Are you optimistic?
Oh, well, you've got to be, otherwise what's the point getting out the bed in the morning? I do think, though, that it'll get better from the day after next year's Scottish Parliament elections. I'm writing off the next 12 months. I really think we're going to have quite a dismal election because there's no sign to me yet that parties are willing to move away from that retail politics that I described a second ago. And of course, we're going to have that new force, divisive, polarising force of reform in the election. No party wants to level with the public about the extent of the problems facing us this side of the election, but they will be unavoidable the day after the election next year. We can see that in the growing fiscal gap in Scotland's budget. Something's got to give, and the politicians are simply going to have to level with us.
What's your sense, Leslie? Optimistic?
Yes, picking up from what Kez said there, though, the thing that Nigel Farage is kind of like a broken system detector, so that, you know, when things are really not working, he's able to kind of come in, give glib, quick solutions. And this is not to say the other parties need to do the same, but by gum, they need vision.
Okay.
You know, we're not traveling on this road just to have kind of, you know, framework documents and so on. It needs something bigger.
Briefly, in a couple of sentences, Ben.
I'm not optimistic, partly because I think that the sustainability of our public services now are groaning under the demands for them. The demographics are going to make the challenge even worse. They're not dealing with them at the moment. I have no confidence that they will deal with them in the future. Sorry to be the dissenting voice.
A fascinating discussion. Thank you all for joining us this evening.